At exactly 3 in the morning, Jungkook stood frozen outside Jimin's door, unable to understand how the person who had always been his safest place could suddenly become the one pushing him away. The cold hallway felt nothing compared to the emptiness in his chest. Jimin had looked at him with trembling eyes, yet somehow found the strength to force him to leave without explaining why. Jungkook thought it was anger, betrayal, or something unforgivable he had done. But as the door slowly closed between them, he noticed something that made his heart sink. Jimin wasn't trying to escape from Jungkook. He was trying to protect him. But from what? For months, Jimin and Jungkook had lived inside a rhythm that seemed almost impossible to break. Their days were filled with rehearsals, recording sessions, late-night meals, quiet car rides, and those small moments that never appear in front of cameras but meant everything to them. Jungkook had grown accustomed to finding Jimin nearby whenever exhaustion became unbearable. Sometimes Jimin would simply sit beside him without asking questions, understanding the silence better than anyone else. And Jungkook had learned to recognize Jimin's moods through the smallest changes in his expression, the way his shoulders dropped after a difficult day, or the way his eyes lingered somewhere far away whenever something was troubling him. Their friendship had survived years of pressure, exhaustion, misunderstandings, and countless moments when the outside world seemed determined to pull them in different directions. To Jungkook, Jimin had become more than someone he trusted. He had become the person he instinctively searched for whenever something went wrong. There was comfort in knowing that no matter how chaotic everything became, there would always be one familiar presence waiting at the end of the day. That was why the first signs of change frightened Jungkook more than he wanted to admit. Jimin began disappearing earlier than usual. He stopped lingering after rehearsals. He started turning away whenever Jungkook entered a room, pretending to be absorbed in his phone or paperwork. At first, Jungkook convinced himself that Jimin was simply tired. Their schedules had become brutal, and everyone was carrying their own exhaustion. RM often noticed how quiet the group had become between schedules. Jin tried to lighten the atmosphere whenever possible, while J-Hope kept encouraging everyone to rest. Suga preferred to stay focused on work, but even he seemed to notice the strange distance growing between the two youngest members of the room. Taeyoung, perhaps more observant than anyone realized, occasionally watched Jimin with an expression that suggested he knew something was wrong. Jungkook noticed it too, but he did not know what it meant. The harder he tried to get closer, the further Jimin seemed to retreat. Messages that once received immediate responses remained unanswered for hours. Plans were quietly canceled. Even the familiar warmth between them began to feel replaced by a careful politeness that hurt more than an argument ever could. One evening, Jungkook found Jimin alone after everyone else had left. The rehearsal room was almost dark, illuminated only by the faint city lights filtering through the windows. Jimin sat on the floor with his back against the mirror, staring at nothing. His expression carried a heaviness that Jungkook had never seen before. Jungkook stayed nearby, hoping that simply being there would be enough. It wasn't. Jimin eventually stood and walked away without looking back. That moment stayed with Jungkook long after the lights were turned off. What he did not know was that Jimin had been carrying something alone for weeks, something that had already begun changing the way he looked at the people closest to him, something that had made him believe that protecting Jungkook required creating distance, even if that distance destroyed the bond they had spent years building. The first real warning came several days later. Jungkook returned home late and noticed that Jimin was awake. The apartment was unusually quiet. There was a small bag near the door, several documents on the table, and a phone screen that went dark the instant Jungkook approached. None of it made sense. Jimin quickly gathered everything and disappeared into his room. Jungkook remained standing in the hallway, staring at the closed door. For the first time, he wondered whether Jimin was hiding something from him. The thought should have disappeared by morning. Instead, it became the beginning of everything that followed. Over the next few days, Jungkook started noticing details he had previously ignored. Jimin looked increasingly exhausted. He sometimes disappeared without telling anyone where he was going. There were moments when he seemed to struggle to breathe normally, only to recover before anyone could notice. Once, Jungkook saw him standing alone outside in the rain, staring at his phone with tears gathering in his eyes. But when Jungkook approached, Jimin immediately wiped his face. That reaction hurt. It told Jungkook that whatever was happening, Jimin had decided he could not be part of it. And that was something Jungkook could not accept. He began quietly searching for answers, not because he wanted to invade Jimin's privacy, but because every instinct inside him was screaming that something was terribly wrong. Yet every possible explanation only made the situation more confusing. There was no obvious betrayal, no argument, no person who seemed responsible, only Jimin's growing silence. Then one night, everything changed. Jungkook received a message asking him to come over. It was unusually late, but he went without hesitation. He assumed Jimin had finally decided to explain what had been happening. Instead, when Jungkook arrived, he found Jimin standing alone beneath the dim light of the apartment hallway. His face was pale. His eyes were red. And for several seconds, neither of them moved. Jungkook could not have known that this would be the last moment their relationship would feel normal. Because before sunrise, he would be standing outside that same door with his belongings in his hands, wondering how the person who once begged him never to disappear could suddenly force him to leave. And the most painful part was that Jimin would not explain why. Not yet. The days that followed became a quiet battle between what Jungkook could see and what Jimin refused to reveal. Every time Jungkook tried to move closer, Jimin seemed to build another invisible wall. It was never dramatic at first. There were no explosive arguments, no accusations shouted across rooms, no obvious betrayal. Instead, the distance appeared through tiny changes that slowly became impossible to ignore. Jimin stopped waiting for Jungkook after rehearsals. He started leaving meals untouched whenever Jungkook sat beside him. Even his smile seemed different, appearing only when he was certain Jungkook was not looking directly at him. And the more Jimin tried to pretend everything was normal, the more obvious it became that something was terribly wrong. Jungkook began carrying the weight of that uncertainty everywhere. During rehearsals, he would catch himself staring at Jimin through the mirror, searching for some explanation in his expression. Jimin always looked composed from a distance, but when the room became quiet, the exhaustion returned to his face. His shoulders seemed heavier. His movements became slower. There were moments when he would close his eyes for several seconds, as though fighting against something invisible inside himself. Jungkook wanted to reach for him, but each attempt was met with another careful retreat. Taeyong noticed the tension before anyone else confronted it. He occasionally found Jungkook sitting alone after everyone had gone, staring at his phone without typing anything. He also noticed Jimin spending more time by himself, but neither of them seemed willing to explain. The silence between them had become too complicated for simple questions. Meanwhile, RM, Jin, Suga, and J-Hope continued trying to keep the group balanced through exhausting schedules. Nobody wanted to add pressure to Jimin or Jungkook, especially when both appeared emotionally drained. Yet the atmosphere was becoming increasingly difficult to hide. Something had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Then Jungkook discovered the first clue. It happened accidentally. He was looking for a charger when he noticed a folder partially hidden beneath several books in the apartment. He did not intend to open it, but the name on the edge of one document immediately caught his attention. It was Jimin's name. Inside were papers that seemed connected to an unfamiliar arrangement involving travel, temporary accommodation, and medical appointments. Jungkook did not understand what they meant, but one detail immediately frightened him. The dates were approaching. Very quickly. He put everything back exactly where he had found it. But the discovery changed everything. Jimin was planning something, and he was planning it without telling him. That night, Jungkook barely slept. His mind created possibility after possibility. Maybe Jimin was leaving. Maybe he had accepted another opportunity. Maybe there was a problem with his work. Maybe someone had threatened him. Maybe the entire situation had nothing to do with Jungkook at all. But one question kept returning. Why was Jimin hiding it? The following morning, Jungkook watched Jimin prepare breakfast as though nothing had happened. His hands moved automatically, but there was something fragile in every movement. Jungkook wanted to confront him about the folder, yet something stopped him. He feared that if he asked too directly, Jimin would retreat even further. So he waited. That decision would become one of his greatest regrets. A few hours later, Jimin received a phone call and immediately stepped outside. Jungkook could not hear the conversation, but he saw Jimin's expression change. His face lost its color. His hand tightened around the phone. For a moment, Jimin seemed unable to move. Then he looked toward the apartment window, straight toward Jungkook. Their eyes met. Jimin quickly turned away. That was when Jungkook realized something terrifying. Jimin wasn't simply hiding information. He was afraid that Jungkook would find out. The question was what he was afraid of. That evening, Jungkook finally attempted to confront the growing distance. But before anything could happen, another complication appeared. A misunderstanding began spreading through the group after Jungkook was seen leaving a private meeting connected to Jimin's schedule. Nobody knew the context. Even Jungkook himself barely understood what he had witnessed. The meeting involved someone from Jimin's personal circle, and the atmosphere had been tense. Jungkook had only arrived because he had followed Jimin after noticing his unusual behavior. He expected to discover the truth. Instead, he saw Jimin handing over an envelope. The person accepted it. Then Jimin walked away looking devastated. Jungkook never saw what was inside, but the image stayed in his mind. An envelope. A secret meeting. Documents. A sudden plan to leave. And Jimin refusing to explain any of it. For the first time, fear began turning into suspicion. Perhaps Jimin no longer trusted him. Perhaps there was something Jimin believed Jungkook had done. Or perhaps someone had convinced Jimin that Jungkook was the reason his life was becoming unbearable. The uncertainty became unbearable. Jungkook started pulling away too. Not because he wanted to punish Jimin, but because being rejected repeatedly was beginning to damage him. He stopped asking questions. He stopped waiting. He stopped checking whether Jimin had eaten. He told himself that if Jimin wanted distance, he would respect it. But Jimin noticed. And instead of feeling relieved, he looked even more broken. One night, Taeyong found Jimin alone in a dark room. There were photographs scattered across the table. Jimin quickly gathered them when he realized someone had entered. Taeyong did not need to see everything. He had already seen enough to understand that Jimin was preparing for something serious. Jimin's expression told him that whatever was happening, it was not something he wanted anyone else to carry. Especially not Jungkook. That same night, Jungkook received an unexpected message from someone he had never met before. The message contained a photograph. It showed Jimin standing outside a hospital. Jungkook stared at the image for several seconds, unable to breathe normally. The date was from 2 days earlier. Jimin had told everyone he was working late. He had never mentioned the hospital. Jungkook immediately called him, but there was no answer. He called again. Nothing. Then another message arrived. This time, it contained only one sentence implying that Jimin had been hiding something that could completely change Jungkook's understanding of everything that had happened between them. Jungkook felt the ground disappear beneath him. He wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding. He wanted to believe Jimin would explain everything. But the next morning, Jimin appeared more distant than ever. And Jungkook made the mistake that would push them toward their breaking point. He confronted Jimin about the hospital. Jimin froze. For several seconds, his expression revealed something close to panic. Then the panic disappeared. What remained was coldness. Jimin denied everything through silence and avoidance, refusing to acknowledge what Jungkook had seen. Instead of explaining, he turned away. Jungkook felt something inside him crack. He had spent weeks trying to protect their bond. Now it felt as though he was the only one fighting for it. The emotional distance became physical. They began occupying separate spaces whenever possible. Their friends noticed but avoided forcing them together. Even shared meals became uncomfortable. Jimin would leave first. Jungkook would wait until the room was empty. Then came another discovery. Jungkook found a small box in Jimin's room. Inside was a collection of memories from their years together. Photographs, small gifts, notes, a bracelet Jungkook had once given him, a ticket from an old trip, tiny objects that meant nothing to anyone else but had clearly been important to Jimin. At the bottom was something Jungkook never expected to see, a sealed envelope with Jungkook's name written on it. His hands trembled. For a moment, he thought this might finally be the explanation. But before he could open it, Jimin entered the room. The shock on Jimin's face was immediate. He crossed the room and took the envelope away. Jungkook stood frozen. That was the first time he saw genuine fear in Jimin's eyes. Not anger. Not disappointment. Fear. And suddenly Jungkook understood that whatever was inside that envelope was connected to everything. Jimin held it against his chest, as though protecting something fragile. Then, without explanation, he left the room. Jungkook remained alone. The unanswered questions became unbearable. Why had Jimin gone to the hospital? Why was he preparing to leave? Why had he collected their memories? And why had he written Jungkook's name on an envelope he refused to let him open? The following days became increasingly painful. Jimin began behaving as though he was preparing for his disappearance. Clothes slowly vanished from his closet. Personal belongings were packed into boxes. Important documents disappeared from the apartment. Jungkook noticed every change. He said nothing. Perhaps he was waiting for Jimin to trust him enough to reveal the truth. Perhaps he was afraid that asking again would finally destroy whatever remained between them. Then one evening, Jungkook overheard a conversation between Jimin and someone outside the apartment. He could not hear every word, but he heard enough to understand one horrifying detail. Jimin was planning to leave without telling anyone, and he intended to do it very soon. Jungkook's heart sank. After everything they had survived together, Jimin was preparing to disappear. The betrayal he felt was overwhelming. That night, Jungkook packed a small bag and prepared to confront him. He did not know that Jimin had already made a completely different decision. A decision that would happen at 3 in the morning. The night began quietly. The apartment was dark. Everyone else had gone to sleep. Jimin remained awake. Jungkook could hear faint movement from the other room. Then silence. Minutes passed. Jungkook finally stepped into the hallway. Jimin was standing near the door. His face looked exhausted. His eyes were swollen. A bag sat beside him. For one brief moment, Jungkook believed this was the moment when Jimin would finally tell him everything. Instead, Jimin looked at him with an expression Jungkook would never forget. It contained love, fear, regret, and something that looked painfully close to goodbye. Jungkook took one step closer. Jimin stepped back. That single movement destroyed whatever hope remained. And then Jimin did something Jungkook never imagined he would ever do. He opened the door. He pushed Jungkook's belongings toward the hallway. And at 3 in the morning, he forced the person he trusted most to leave. Jungkook stood outside, completely stunned. He could not understand how they had reached this point. But the truth was even more devastating than the rejection itself. Jimin was not throwing Jungkook away because he hated him. He was doing it because he believed staying close to him would put Jungkook in danger. And the secret behind that belief was about to change both of their lives forever. Jungkook stood in the hallway at 3 in the morning, staring at the closed door as though it had become a wall between two completely different lives. His belongings rested beside his feet, barely packed, almost thrown together in the urgency of the moment. The silence was unbearable. There had been countless nights when he and Jimin had stayed awake until sunrise, sharing exhaustion, memories, and the comfort of knowing neither had to face the darkness alone. Yet now the same hallway felt colder than anywhere Jungkook had ever been. He could still remember Jimin's expression before the door closed. There had been no hatred in his eyes. That was what made it hurt even more. Jungkook remained there, unable to walk away. His mind desperately searched for an explanation that could make sense of what had happened. He replayed every strange moment from the previous weeks. The hospital, the documents, the hidden envelope, the photographs, the sudden distance, the packed belongings. Every unanswered question had led to this single devastating moment. Then the door opened again. Jimin stood there. For a second, Jungkook believed he might finally explain everything. Instead, Jimin looked at him with an expression so exhausted that Jungkook barely recognized him. The truth was already visible in Jimin's face. He had been crying. Not because he wanted Jungkook gone, because he believed he had no choice. Jimin's hands trembled as he held the door. Behind him, the apartment was almost completely dark. On the table sat the same documents Jungkook had noticed days earlier. Beside them was the sealed envelope bearing Jungkook's name. Jungkook finally understood that the envelope had not been a secret meant to betray him. It had been a goodbye. But there was still something missing. Why would Jimin need to say goodbye while they were still standing in the same city? The answer came through the hospital documents. Jimin had been dealing with a serious situation that had remained hidden from everyone. The appointments were not ordinary checkups. The tests, consultations, and emergency visits had been connected to a condition that had suddenly changed the plans he had made for the future. But even that was not the whole truth. Jimin had discovered that someone had been using his private information to manipulate his schedule and movements. At first, he believed it was merely an invasion of privacy. Then, threatening messages began appearing. Some contained photographs of Jungkook. Others showed locations where Jungkook had recently been. The message was clear. Someone knew how important Jungkook was to Jimin, and they were using that bond against him. Jimin had tried to handle everything quietly. He had contacted people he trusted, arranged temporary accommodation, attended appointments without telling the others, and collected every piece of evidence he could find. But each time he thought the situation was becoming safer, another warning appeared. The most frightening one had arrived only hours before he pushed Jungkook out. It contained a photograph of Jungkook entering the building. The photograph had been taken from a distance. Whoever had taken it knew where he was. Jimin realized that keeping Jungkook close was no longer an act of protection. It was an invitation to danger. That was why he had created distance. That was why he had refused to explain. That was why he had allowed Jungkook to believe he was being rejected. Jimin had convinced himself that if Jungkook hated him, he would eventually stop trying to follow him. It was a cruel strategy. But in Jimin's mind, cruelty was easier to survive than losing Jungkook permanently. The envelope contained everything. Copies of the threatening messages, photographs, dates, names, evidence of the attempts to track them, and a handwritten explanation that Jimin had prepared because he knew he might not be able to say it aloud. Jungkook finally saw it. His entire understanding of the past few weeks collapsed. The person he thought was abandoning him had been quietly protecting him. The person he believed no longer trusted him had actually trusted him so deeply that he was willing to let himself be hated. And the person Jungkook had accused of hiding the truth had been carrying the fear alone. Jungkook's anger disappeared. In its place came something much heavier. Guilt. He remembered every moment he had suspected Jimin. Every time he had looked at him and wondered whether their friendship no longer mattered. Jimin had been suffering while Jungkook had been wondering why he was no longer being loved the same way. The realization was devastating. But the danger had not disappeared. Taeyong had already discovered part of the truth earlier that evening. He had contacted RM, Jin, Suga, and J-Hope, and they had begun piecing together what Jimin had been hiding. The group finally realized that his strange behavior had never been about Jungkook. It had been about fear. They also discovered that Jimin had been preparing to leave because he believed the safest solution was to disappear temporarily. But there was one problem. Jimin planned to go alone. He believed that separating himself from everyone would stop the threats. Jungkook refused to accept that sacrifice. For the first time that night, the emotional distance between them began to break. Jungkook understood that protecting someone did not always mean pushing them away. Sometimes protection meant standing beside them when they were terrified. Sometimes loyalty meant refusing to leave even when leaving would be easier. And sometimes love friendship, and trust required the courage to face danger together instead of allowing one person to carry everything alone. The evidence was immediately shared with the appropriate people, and the situation began moving beyond something Jimin could control by himself. The group stayed together. Security measures were strengthened. Schedules were adjusted. Every suspicious contact and message was documented. But the emotional damage remained. Jimin had spent weeks believing that sacrificing his relationship with Jungkook was the only way to protect him. Jungkook had spent those same weeks believing he was being abandoned. Both had been suffering from the same fear. Neither had known how to say it. The most painful discovery came when Jungkook finally opened the envelope completely. Inside was a collection of memories. Not just photographs, but small reminders of everything Jimin believed Jungkook might someday forget. There were moments from years earlier, memories of difficult rehearsals, quiet celebrations, exhausted nights, and ordinary days that had somehow become precious. Jimin had kept them because he believed he might never have another chance to experience those moments. At the very bottom was a final page. It explained that Jimin had never wanted Jungkook to think he was unwanted. The morning after everything was revealed did not feel like a victory. There was no sudden return to normal, no magical disappearance of the pain that had accumulated over weeks. The apartment was quiet, the city outside slowly waking beneath a pale morning sky, while Jimin sat near the window with the exhausted stillness of someone who had finally put down a burden he had carried for too long. For the first time in weeks, he did not have to hide the fear in his face. Yet freedom from the secret came with another realization. Protecting Jungkook had cost him something he had never expected to lose so deeply. He had almost convinced the person closest to him that he was no longer wanted. Jungkook spent that same morning surrounded by the evidence that had changed everything. The photographs, documents, messages, and memories no longer looked like pieces of a mystery. They looked like pieces of Jimin's loneliness. Every page showed another moment when Jimin had chosen silence instead of asking for help. Every date revealed another day when Jungkook had mistaken fear for rejection. The realization did not make the pain disappear. If anything, it made the pain sharper because Jungkook now understood that both of them had been hurting at the same time while believing they were protecting themselves from one another. RM, Jin, Suga, J-Hope, and Taeyoon remained close during the days that followed. Their presence became a quiet reminder that neither Jimin nor Jungkook needed to carry everything alone. The group adjusted their routines, tightened security, and made sure Jimin attended the appointments he had previously handled by himself. There was no longer any room for secret meetings or disappearing without explanation. Every decision that could affect the group was discussed openly. For Jimin, that change was uncomfortable. He had spent so long believing that asking for help was a burden that accepting support felt almost unnatural. He had always been capable of enduring difficult situations quietly, convincing himself that strength meant absorbing pain without allowing it to reach anyone else. But now he was beginning to understand that there was another kind of strength. The strength to admit fear. The strength to trust people. The strength to allow someone else to stand beside you when you no longer have the energy to stand alone. Jungkook was learning something similar. For days, he had been tempted to apologize repeatedly, as though enough apologies could erase every moment of doubt. But he eventually realized that what Jimin needed was not endless guilt from him. Jimin needed consistency. So Jungkook stopped trying to repair everything in one day. He simply stayed. He returned to the small routines that had once made their friendship feel effortless. He left food nearby when Jimin forgot to eat. He waited during appointments without demanding explanations. He gave Jimin space when he needed silence, but never allowed that silence to become isolation again. There was no pressure, no demand that Jimin immediately return to the person he had been before. Just patience. And slowly, Jimin began responding. At first, the changes were almost invisible. He started sitting in the same room again. Then he began joining meals. Later, he stopped hiding his phone whenever Jungkook entered. Small things. Almost meaningless to anyone watching from the outside. But to them, those moments represented something enormous. Trust was returning. Not the old kind of trust that existed before the crisis, because neither of them was the same person anymore. It was a new trust, one built from honesty rather than assumption. One afternoon, Jimin found himself standing outside the same apartment door where everything had changed. The memory of 3 in the morning returned without warning. He remembered the cold hallway, Jungkook's belongings on the floor, his own trembling hands, the unbearable decision to push away the person he loved most as a friend because he believed distance could keep him safe. For the first time, Jimin allowed himself to admit how terrified he had been. Not of the threats, not even of what might happen to him. He had been terrified of what would happen to Jungkook if his secret failed to protect him. That fear had controlled every decision. But now he could see the flaw in it. By trying to protect Jungkook from pain, he had created another kind of pain. By trying to keep Jungkook safe from danger, he had made him believe he was being abandoned. By trying to sacrifice their trust, he had nearly destroyed the very bond that gave him courage. The realization stayed with him. And when Jungkook eventually found him near the doorway, neither needed to explain what the location meant. The past was there between them, but it no longer had to control the future. The healing did not happen through one dramatic moment. It happened through hundreds of ordinary ones. A shared meal, a quiet car ride, a familiar laugh returning after days of silence. Jimin no longer disappearing without explanation. Jungkook no longer assuming that silence meant rejection. They began learning how to ask instead of assume, how to listen instead of defend, how to stay instead of escape. Jimin became more protective of his privacy and more careful about who had access to personal information. The group also became more aware of the invisible pressure surrounding their lives. What had once seemed like ordinary attention could sometimes become something far more invasive. But the experience also changed the way they viewed one another. Jungkook no longer saw Jimin only as the person who could always handle everything. He saw the vulnerability beneath the strength. Jimin no longer saw Jungkook only as someone he needed to protect. He began seeing him as someone capable of standing beside him. That distinction mattered, because protection without trust could become control. Sacrifice without communication could become abandonment. And love without honesty could become another form of loneliness. Weeks passed. The immediate danger continued to fade. The investigation progressed. Life slowly returned to a more familiar rhythm. Yet neither of them forgot that night. 3 in the morning remained a strange landmark in their memories. It represented the worst misunderstanding they had ever experienced. But it also represented the moment when the truth finally forced them to confront something they had both avoided. Neither of them could protect the other by pretending everything was fine. One evening, long after the crisis had passed, Jungkook found the envelope again. It was no longer hidden. Jimin had placed it openly among the other memories. That small change said more than an apology could have. The envelope was no longer a goodbye. It was evidence of how close they had come to losing each other. Jungkook looked through the photographs one more time. There were old memories everywhere. Moments when they had laughed until they could barely breathe. Moments when exhaustion had nearly broken them. Moments when one had quietly supported the other without expecting recognition. Jungkook realized that relationships were not defined only by their happiest moments. Sometimes they were defined by what happened after the worst moments. By whether people chose revenge or understanding. By whether they allowed fear to permanently separate them. By whether they were willing to rebuild something that had been damaged. Jimin eventually joined him. They sat together without needing to fill the silence. For a long time, neither moved. The silence was different now. It no longer felt like rejection. It felt safe. That was perhaps the greatest sign that they had healed. The same silence that once frightened Jungkook had become something comforting again, and Jimin no longer needed to hide inside it. The story of that night could easily have ended with Jungkook walking away. If he had allowed anger to control him, the distance might have become permanent. If Jimin had continued believing that sacrifice required complete isolation, he might have disappeared without ever allowing anyone to understand why. But they chose differently. They chose honesty. They chose patience. They chose to remain. And that choice mattered more than any dramatic apology could have. There was still healing ahead. Some memories would remain painful. Some fears would return unexpectedly. There would be moments when Jimin became too quiet and Jungkook would instinctively worry. There would be moments when Jungkook became distant because old feelings of rejection resurfaced. But now they knew how to recognize those moments. They knew that silence did not always mean abandonment. They knew that fear did not have to become secrecy. And most importantly, they knew that asking for help did not make either of them weak. The night at 3 in the morning had begun with a door closing, but the meaning of that door had changed. It was no longer remembered simply as the night Jimin kicked Jungkook out. It became the night both of them learned that even the strongest bonds could fracture when fear replaced communication. And they also learned something more powerful. A broken bond is not always a lost bond. Sometimes it is an invitation to rebuild with greater honesty than before. Jimin had tried to protect Jungkook by sacrificing their trust. Jungkook had nearly lost Jimin because he mistook that sacrifice for betrayal. Neither had been completely right, and perhaps that was why their reconciliation mattered. It was not perfect. It was not effortless. It did not erase the past. It simply proved that forgiveness could coexist with painful memories. That trust could return after being shaken. That loyalty could survive misunderstanding. And that sometimes the person who pushes you away is not trying to tell you that you mean nothing. Sometimes they are terrified that you mean everything. The final lesson remained with them long after the crisis ended. Never assume that distance means hatred. Never mistake silence for indifference. And never believe that sacrificing yourself in secret is the only way to protect someone you love. Because the people closest to you cannot help you fight a battle they do not know exists. Jimin learned that he did not have to carry every burden alone. Jungkook learned that trust required more than believing someone would never hurt him. It also required believing that someone might be hurting too. And together, they learned that the strongest form of loyalty was not standing beside someone only when everything was easy. It was staying when the truth was painful, staying when forgiveness took time, staying when trust had to be rebuilt one small moment at a time. The door at 3 in the morning had once separated them. Months later, it became just another door. Nothing more. Nothing less. And perhaps that was the most beautiful ending of all. Because the most meaningful reconciliation does not always arrive with tears, dramatic promises, or perfect words. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through a person choosing to stay, through another person finally allowing them to, and through the understanding that no matter how dark the night becomes, the people who truly matter should never have to face it alone. If this story touched something inside you, remember this. Sometimes the hardest goodbye is not the end of a relationship. Sometimes it is the moment before two people finally learn how to understand each other. And sometimes, behind the door that closes at 3 in the morning, there's a truth waiting to prove that love, loyalty, and trust are stronger when they are shared rather than carried alone.